Erica. Super excited to be with you today to go over growth in AI. I'm going to let you tell us all about yourself and share more about what we're going to be learning.
Awesome. Thank you, Paolo. It's nice to be here and with all of you. As Paolo mentioned, my name is Erika Warren. I recently co-founded an AI health tech company called Insightful Med. This is relatively new news. I will be sure to share more about that later in the community. But before that, I've spent most of my tech career in building product and growth teams in consumer marketplace businesses. I like to say I was in the game before growth was a thing, and we used to call it marketing. But a lot has changed since then. I'm back as an instructor for Reforge's Growth Series course this fall, and you'll hear a little bit more about that later as well. Today, I want to talk to you about AI and how it can impact growth. My TLDR for you is this: AI is an incredible tool and you can use it to accelerate your growth, but that only works well and you'll save yourself a lot of time if you understand how your business works first, you understand your growth system, and you know where you can apply the tool. You need a blueprint of your business backed with data so that you can determine where to deploy these resources and you don't, waste a bunch of experimentation cycles. None of that has unfortunately changed, while many other things have. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some work that my team did while I was at change.org, where I led growth and product, and how we used AI to effectively drive growth. I'm going to leave plenty of time for Q&A and your questions, so please drop them in the chat, or I'm sorry, in the Q&A function, as Paolo mentioned. Okay, but first let's start with a shared definition of what I mean when I say growth. I made the joke or the quip that we used to call growth marketing, and that was because of this formula, which is pretty straightforward. We build, and then we market, and if you're in B2B, then you may have had a sales team. And there were siloed departments and handoffs at each point. And then things changed over a decade ago. They stopped working, that formula stopped working and being as effective as a way to grow. And there are four major changes that you've probably heard us talk about, so I won't belabor them. But distribution became more competitive and expensive, and therefore less effective. Our channel life cycles were getting shorter, and so we had to adapt a lot faster. Data access became an equalizer and was democratized through tools, and everybody in the organization could have the data, not just engineering or product or like little pieces. And then last but not least, like the roles got very blurry. All of a sudden, there were tools that made it easier for non-technical people to do stuff and analyze the results. And so everything, people started feeling like they were stepping on each other's toes. Now, more than a decade later, AI is here and it's accelerating all of these macro changes even more. LLMs are becoming a new distribution channel for many businesses and disrupting behemoths that we've relied on, like Google. AI continues to democratize data even further, leading into insights in addition to just access. And AI now has a seat at the table on most teams who are now figuring out how do we define what role AI plays on our teams and what jobs it does rather than individuals, so that frees us up to do other things. So when I talk about growth, what I'm talking about is the system that you see. The inputs are in the wheel, and then the foundational elements that drive a company's growth. This is the blueprint to understand. None of them are replaced by AI, but AI's role can make the system more efficient when deployed in specific areas. And that's what I want to talk about today with our case. So I found in my experience that there are three primary buckets where AI can accelerate growth motions. That's in reducing user friction, optimizing existing processes, and increasing your internal bandwidth. And I'm going to share examples from my time and the team's time on each one of those three buckets. So first, just get a lay of the land, change.org is a platform for anyone to create change. It's second only to voting. Petitions are a tool that's most successful at influencing people in power, and particularly those in politics. The simplistic growth loop I have mapped out here changes, like for change to happen, it starts with what we call the trigger. For change.org, that trigger is reactive. Something has to happen that causes someone to want to influence a decision maker. It's a very hard trigger to influence on ourselves. You can't just wake up and be like, what do I want to change today? It hasn't been very effective. After the trigger, there are actions that need to happen. First, we need to create a petition. It needs to be shared. It needs to gather signatures. And after enough momentum, the reward in this loop is that if successful, we create change, right? We had the mechanism in which that happened. This is obviously a gross simplification, but what's important to know is that without petitions, there is no business. So growing the number of petitions while also making sure that they were high quality and had the best chance of winning, that reward part of the loop, was always the goal. So where we started, and because petitions were the currency, creation has always been a primary KPI for the company. And it's a huge point of friction. Anytime you have to ask someone for an input, that creates friction in your conversion flow. Now, imagine trying to get somebody to write something. It's like a huge, huge block. So our first and sort of slightly obvious experimentation with AI was here and the petition creation flow. When I run experiments and lead growth teams, what I'm looking for are big results, either hugely positive or hugely negative. And that tells me that we struck a nerve, that there's something within the consumer mindset or instinct that they're reacting to, and we want to uncover and learn that. We saw this immediately with this experiment where we launched a first test, and the usage was our primary metric. Was it high? Were people going to engage with this feature? Was there intent? Were we right in our assumption that this was a huge friction point? We saw greater than 50% of people interacting with this feature, which is tremendous. And this was almost 2 years ago, mind you, before the general public even knew or used GPTs like they do today. Through iteration, we got to the following results. We boosted conversion rate by reducing the friction. We increased quality, which was really important. So this wasn't just a bunch of junk leads. And this was one of the most successful experiments that we ran and eventually implemented. It's in the product today in my 2 years' time there. We learned a ton about prompt tuning, that we were able to improve the quality metric by using vast amounts of data that we had in training the model, really on hundreds of thousands of petitions, so that we could mirror that structure in writing. Things like longer petitions did better. Things with emotion, did language with emotion, and keeping the language really simplistic at no higher than an 8th grade reading level, all outperformed our prompts as we tuned the model over time. Another area where we reduced friction was on identifying who decision makers are on a petition. The decision maker is who the petition should be sent to, who actually has the power to create change that the petition seeks. And this is a really hard question for users to answer, but it's critical for the product to be effective, to get to that reward. It's not enough to just create a petition and let it live in the ether. It has to find its audience. And we were able to build a tool internally that used some AI, but also used our data scientists to hone a lot of that. This wasn't off the shelf, to identify the real relevant decision makers for petition creators to add. The results were also pretty incredible and large. We saw high interaction rates. We doubled the number of petitions that were tagged with a decision maker on our first iteration of this, right after launch. This was a huge unlock. And this was a task that had previously been done by humans or left to the creators themselves, which means we had a wide margin to cover. But it wasn't a slam dunk by any means. The doubling petitions tag got us close to like, we went from like 15 to 35% of petitions tagged. And it was a far cry from where we know we needed to be. We learned here that the biggest unlock was that people still didn't understand. There was no substitute for user education and understanding. People did not understand what a decision maker was. So even being able to make it easier for them to add one, they were like, why is this important? How does it matter? Like, we hadn't done enough work in the product to explain the context of why this step mattered and all the information around it. So we had a lot more tuning to do there that wasn't really AI specific. It also led to like some pretty big internal debates about if this feature should be user selected or auto selected, right? If you're chasing a metric, like I want to have the petitions have the most amount of decision makers tagged, your immediate instinct is going to be, let's just automate it. The recommender is recommending something for everyone. It seems to be great. But if we do that, like what are the downstream implications? And is that really the right metric we want to add? We knew that there is something as good friction here where having the user have a say in selecting the decision makers help them stay bought in, helps them stay engaged with the petition, helps them take further actions that make a petition successful. And so this was still, when I left, this was like a big open question of what we were going to do and how we were going to test it to determine which path we were going to go. But I wanted to highlight that because I think it's a caution when you're trying to remove friction. There's a lot of friction you can remove, but not all of it is bad. And you need to figure out through testing which part is going to be most effective for you. Okay. So that's my two examples related to reducing user friction. The other way that we successfully used AI was around optimizing existing processes. And what you'll see here, this is common on a lot of teams. Lots of teams are using AI for content creation, for copy, for images, for marketing materials and campaigns. One of the ways that we sort of uniquely implemented this type of approach was that we used GPTs to generate 4 custom headlines, share headlines per petition. So when somebody signs a petition, they're prompted to share it. And what shows up on Facebook or WhatsApp or whatever channel you share would often see what you see on the left side of the screen here, which says, join Erika in supporting this petition, and had the petition headline. But what we were able to do was personalize those titles to make them more appealing, more in basic language, and something that's a little bit more eye-catching on social that would lead to more action. This would have never been possible at the scale that we needed it to without an AI solution. And the bandit process here, if you're unfamiliar, a multi-arm bandit is a way to run experimentation that optimizes the results of your test in real time. And that part of the process already existed at Change. All we were doing is sending through new content. And the multi-arm bandit was an unlock for Change years ago in ways to optimize growth. But the personalization of that content at the unique unit level was another big unlock. You can see that we ended up increasing our K factor pretty substantially and having impact on downstream business metrics like the number of signatures and the revenue generated from those petitions, all through this like what seemingly felt like minor optimization. Okay. The third example of using AI to impact growth is around figuring out how it can unlock internal bandwidth for you. And this may be the best and easiest place to start for many companies because you're probably all resource constrained. I feel like you have way too much to do. One problem that plagued us for years was that unstructured data. Petitions were initially tagged by users, like what is the topic of this petition? Those tags could be user generated, so the tags themselves were not standardized. And all of that led to the data being in a state that was largely very difficult to use or to synthesize and extrapolate learnings from. And not to mention, the data analytics team at change.org is 3 people. It's a very small, lean team. There's just too much work and volume for them to sort of make sense of this data and tackle it and answer all of the questions that all of the various stakeholders had. So we ignored this problem for a long time. It was too big of an engineering lift to fix. And we then figured out, I have an idea. Let's use AI to classify and structure our data. And practically overnight, we went from an unstructured mess to standardized groupings in a taxonomy that ended up enabling almost every other team in the country. Marketing was able to create segmentations for campaigns, for email and for other channels. We were able to speed up our other content loops that fed distribution and acquisition, like in SEO. And we were even able to start considering and designing what on-site personalization might look like based on some of the segmentation. So this was a huge unlock that had ramifications and really allowed the possibilities that we dreamed about in the roadmap to become much more of a lighter lift. Okay, now that was a whirlwind. Very quickly, 4 examples and 3 areas that you can think about using AI within your work stream and to drive growth. But the specifics of all of those are really less important. I wanted to give you illustrations to bring it to life, but what I want to leave you with are these 4 things. Our success with AI was possible as quickly as it was because we already had done the work to understand our growth engine. It wasn't a coincidence that the first thought was like, I know where the most friction in the funnel is for our users. Like, let's try there. We had already done that user research. We had already done the modeling. We already knew that if we moved this metric, it would have huge returns on our growth loops. So again, like AI is a powerful tool and you will speed up your cycles if you know where to deploy it first. So do the work to understand the growth, the fundamentals. The second takeaway here is that most of our leverage and impact came from reducing friction, the place where I started. And I think that's common. That's where you see most AI products sort of like going after that problem in their flows. Like it's a feature that's helping you generate content, that's reducing friction, that's spinning the loop faster. Third, these tools can be a tremendous equalizer for under-resourced teams, like the 3-person data team that I mentioned. If AI is a contentious topic in your company and you're not sure how to get leadership on board, I would start here. Start where it's not user-facing, but it's helping you speed up your work streams and show that this is not a scary thing that you can experiment with to drive results. And lastly, just a reminder that success is contagious. Like all things in growth, the learnings are what we are needing to celebrate, not the wins. On most experiments, you are an excellent growth team if you have a 20% win rate, which means that 80% of your experiments lose. And so if you're only celebrating wins, you're going to start to create a culture of fear rather than curiosity. And so celebrating the wins, celebrating the learnings, sharing out what was a flop, what was a loss, and creates this culture that ends up being very contagious. By the time I left change.org earlier this year, the legal team was the team that was experimenting the most with AI. And that wasn't just because they wanted to understand how they needed to protect the company. It was because they were also one of the most under-resourced teams and were using it to drive their processes and workflows and become way more efficient. And it just goes to show you that we didn't hide what we were doing. We shared it publicly and we got a lot more people on board. So I encourage you to do the same. Okay, I'm going to get to Q&A in just a minute. But first, I wanted to share that if you want to hear from other companies and how they're using AI for growth and their take on all of this, because this is mine, you should consider taking Growth Series this fall, which I'm teaching, and it starts in September. We have a new lineup of cases and new guests who will be talking about how they are integrating AI into their workflows. This includes Raman from Perplexity, how Amplitude is using AI that Laura will talk about, how Canva is using AI and how they're monetizing it with Rich Fleming, and how Wistia is also approaching this and how you can model out your growth loops. In the course, we spend 4 weeks going deep on the areas that you can see here that are marked in the growth system. And so enrollment is open. Live sessions are on Wednesdays. There are 2 time slots for you to pick from. I love old memes. So if you want more of that too, you should sign up. So run, Forrest, run to enrollment. Okay, with that, let's jump into Q&A.
Great. I can help with the Q&A. We've got a few questions here. So let's start off with this question from Alexei. For the
Hi,
decision maker
Alexei.
algorithm, other than seeing more impact, did you also make an impact on recurring petitions, virality, etc.?
That's a good question. The answer is, I don't know. The petition life cycle is long. It's one of the hardest parts of working on growth in this business. Change does not happen overnight in most cases. The average length was like 90 days that we paid attention to. And this was something that we just hadn't had enough time to happen to be able to measure those further downstream implications. My guess, though, would likely be yes on virality and no on recurring petitions. And only no on recurring petitions because once you institute change, you're like, whew, I'm done. I did my part. I don't want to do that again. That's like the majority, not everybody, but there's a small segment of people that change their behavior and get more out of it. But what we saw was this is largely more of like a one and done type problem, like a low frequency product for starters, for petition creators. And so the things that we were trying to influence in that are like, how do you make that one experience excellent so that when you can use those people to create word of mouth and virality for the platform overall, even if they're not going to come back and have the need to create change again the next day, for example.
All right, we've got more and more questions coming in. Thanks everybody for submitting questions. Remember to upload them if there's any questions that you particularly resonate with. Next one from Kathy. Which part of user education should be manual? Course content, training of the LLM, what part?
Of user education. So this for me was more, and I think we're referencing the decision maker tool where I said that we still learn that even though we were automating that flow and making it easier for people to add relevant decision makers to the petition, it didn't solve the question of what is a decision maker and why is this important. And so part of that user education was really left on the UX and like the product marketing and content that goes along with this important step and why it actually matters. And no, I mean, maybe you can have an AI chatbot that explains that, but the job is still the same. You need to be able to be building that into the product experience that is explaining like why you're meeting the user's mindset where they're at. So if they're new and they don't know how this works, like you have to match them at that point that they don't know how it works and bring them through it. The thing that we debated was like, we could potentially make this super simple. Tell us what you want to change in the world. We'll handle the rest. And it's like, does that actually drive growth if you remove all of that friction? And what we found was that you need buy-in, like you need users to be engaged to keep a petition moving because it doesn't happen overnight. And so if we remove too much of that, then people are like, oh, I don't need to do anything. Like that was too easy, and they forget about it. And so we were constantly in this balance of how do we remove a lot of the hard part, but still keep people engaged so that they still have high intensity. And that was where the education part came in for us. In terms of like training the LLM and course content, like tons and tons of, I mean, like this is where all of the work went into, right? It's like we spent so much time manually QAing the results of all of our AI tests. Like what were the petitions being generated? What did they look like? Were they good? Did they have the same patterns? Were they hallucinating facts? Like that would be tremendously damaging for a brand if the product was doing that. And so like there was no substitute for us manually doing that and thinking through those problems and adjusting our prompts there. So that's the other half of your question, Kathy.
Another question here is, can you speak a bit more about how you leverage AI to standardize internal data? Was this a product you onboarded, or was it a system you built internally? How'd you do it?
Yeah, this one is like near and dear to my heart because this is like my thing. Like I have my experience within marketplaces is like you use the power of the marketplace data to tell every individual how to improve their business, right? If you're a restaurant on Grubhub, the benefit of the platform is knowing what the most successful restaurants do to be successful. And that's just common marketplace dynamics. And we weren't doing that because we didn't have our data in a place that allowed us to synthesize and roll up those insights for creators. And so how we did this is we first created a standard taxonomy. The question became, what are the right tags? If users can add whatever tag they want, that creates a problem. So like first, let's define what the right categories should be. And we used a public philanthropic database of like issues in the world to create that taxonomy. Then we just use GPT to feed through petitions and have it score like on a relevancy score, basically, where it would tag and spit out a score for each one of the categories up to, I think, 10 that were like topics that were relevant for there. And then from there, we looked at the data and decided like, is this accurate? Do we need better definition of what these categories are when we tell the LLM on how to tag it? Again, we use a manual process to go through and check if this would match how we would categorize those things in our definitions. We refine the definitions, and then we decided how many we wanted to add sort of to the database with their relevant scores. And then that allowed us to have all this data for them to say like, okay, for like an on-site customization, we only want to show things that are like a 9 out of 10 on relevancy, right? And that score. But maybe the marketing team wants to do a different type of drip campaign. And so they're going to look at other categories that maybe you might be interested in, but you're not like, I'm obsessed with animal rights, but I might also be obsessed with something else, right? And build those connections. And so having all of that data allowed teams to sort of change the rules based on the situation and the experience they were trying to build.
Now we've got a question that's more on strategy. So could you briefly explain how to create a growth engine or growth loop from a very early stage startup perspective while keeping AI at the center of the strategy? How do you balance that?
Yeah, you just described my life. As I mentioned, I co-founded a company a few months ago, and there are 3 people working on it. So, I mean, the first place you need to think about is like, you probably don't have any data. I don't have any data in my company. My company and my product are still being built, but I've built the growth model that we anticipate being able to use. I've thought through how should this product grow? What are the interactions? And I've started to put dummy data into the model to say, where are the highest points of leverage that change? Like if my assumptions are right, we're going to need to focus on this first step of creation because it's going to have an outsized impact on other parts. And so this hypothesis and this framework was something that I was able to sit down with my co-founder with yesterday. And I was like, look at this model. Like, we're going to run out of cash if we don't address this, this, and this. It changed the priorities of what we were building. by looking at the model. And then in terms of like keeping AI at the center of the strategy, for us, AI is part of the product. So that's sort of a no-brainer. But I use it almost every day to say, like, how do I get more resources? Like, there's only one of me. How am I going to create this pitch deck, find investors, all of the things that you have to do? And so our go-to is, how do we leverage those tools first? Not only because it helps us understand how other companies are using them, but they're saving us internal resources. It gets to that third point, and I probably use that more than anything else in my role today versus the reduced friction that I talked about for a more established product or company.
That's actually a great segue, because speaking of, say, either growth teams that are small, scrappy, or just want to offload or leverage AI, what are some things that growth teams just hate doing that could probably be taken over by AI agents?
I would say just make a list of the things that you hate doing and then see what the quality is. A lot of the challenge, I did this yesterday. I tried to use a product to create a pitch deck and it was worse than the pitch deck I already had. So like some things, the technology just isn't there yet. Or there's a learning curve that I just wasn't willing to. I already had a pitch deck, right? I was trying to make it incrementally better. So the learning curve to make it awesome wasn't something that I was willing to invest time in. But the places where I've seen it used most are really around like analysis and writing. Most, if we're talking LLMs and you're going to use something off the shelf, most LLMs are better at synthesis and then generating something completely like from scratch. I personally use it all the time to copy edit and to refine copy and sort of like help with first drafts of things when I have like a bulleted list. And so if you're in an organization, I hope you're not, that relies on PRDs, I don't love PRDs, that would be a thing that I would try to have them do. If you have to write weekly updates and you're just pulling from a list of these are the things that happen, like you can use it to do that. Again, I would think about where do you spend a lot of time and where do you not, what sucks your energy rather than gives you energy, and see if you can offload some of that. The knowledge and the critical thinking and decision making can't be replaced by AI today, and that's where you're most valuable in your role.
Now let's shift back to how you actually had AI features in product. So how do you test AI features before releasing? How do you build confidence that it's at least functioning as intended?
Yeah. For the petition generator, for example, the draft generator, we tested it like we test any other A/B experiment. We built it, we QA'd it, we tested it on a small amount of traffic and scrutinized heavily the content that was coming back. We had a fair confidence that the content would be okay because we could also run it on sample data. So we had, hundreds of thousands of petitions. The generator was operating off of like a very small segment of content, like the title you would write first, and maybe, 100 characters more about the problem. And so we started with using historical data to say, what do we think this is going to look like? That helped us refine the prompt to feel like we feel good about what we were going to put into production. And then we just sort of ramped traffic that way over time. Again, it was also important to set the expectation that we didn't expect this to like drastically improve conversion overnight. Like we wanted to see, will people even use it? Are they afraid of AI? Are they going to be like, I'm offended that you're asking me to do this or not? And so having the right expectations was important. I operate from a place of like, ask for forgiveness rather than permission, which may not work in your company. And so part of my job as a leader was to encourage the team to run and take bigger risks like this and focus more on the upside and the learning rather than the individual results. It just so happened that we saw pretty good results right off the get-go, off the jump.
This is related. So when you were implementing, say, auto classification of petitions, how did you deal with false positives or hallucinations?
Yeah, so one of the challenges that we had is that when we tried to train a model off of a bunch of trading data, the best petitions have a lot of facts in them. And so the LLMs were starting to hallucinate facts. Like it was like, oh, this is what you need. And that quickly became part of the prompt tuning of what you had to explicitly tell the LLM not to do and change sort of our training data. We also then put a lot of friction, like this part made the step easy, but the user friction and the flow became double check these types of information, like go through and make sure that the information here is correct. There were like a couple extra clicks and steps so that we were using the petition starter, that they understood that this was a draft and that there was going to need to be things edited. One of the metrics we ended up really paying attention to was how many petitions, and trying to optimize for was how many petitions were actually edited versus published explicitly without any edits from the generation. And that was, again, like our intent was this to be a draft tool, just like how you might use it in your own role, not a ghostwriter, like for publish. And so we spent a lot of time in the UX refining that part. And then on the removing some of the hallucinations that became part of the prompt tuning. It's also gotten better as the models is OpenAI, we were using GPT, has improved as well.
Hallucinations is a good example of when implementing AI, there can be a little bit of hesitance from stakeholders because hallucinating facts can be scary. So somebody wanted to know just more about the process of implementing AI. So what did it look like from a budgeting perspective, regulatory compliance, or even just managing resistance to change internally? What did that look like?
Yeah, it was. I like to understand what, like, every company's risk tolerance is going to be different, and you need to understand what's a one-way door versus a two-way door. And that became part of like my primary language. It's like, if this doesn't work, we can turn it off. I can turn it off at 2 o'clock in the morning. I can turn it off like by certain geographies. Like we had the flexibility to say that this is like, we have a culture of learning. We all agree on that. We understand that this is a future. If we aren't inputting this into the product, users are going to be using other tools to do this and bring it to our platform. So shouldn't we want to be in control of the prompts and understand where the hallucinations are coming, like to better protect the platform and the credibility and, you know, controlling for disinformation if it's within the product rather than people bringing it. Like those were the conversations that we were having, and everyone sort of agreed, like, yes, we need to learn here, understand where the challenges are going to be and see what happens. And so it was, again, just a very much a culture around testing and reducing the risk through understanding that this wasn't being coded in brick, right? Like we weren't building something for perpetuity right out the gate. And it's something that we have a lot of monitoring on still. And so that was sort of like the way that we handled that type of like risk calculation. Yeah, I think there's more to say there, but I also am conscious of time.
This is a somewhat related question. This is more about your own growth of product teams. So how do you lead AI teams, say, in growth of product when there's, say, little or no heavy technical knowledge?
Yeah, so we had a team of data scientists, a machine learning and AI team at Change that was its own thing working on separately. And I think we got to the point where that model needed to be more like the growth model, where that skill set was going to need to be embedded on other teams, like more of a distributed model. where they can come together to work on a big project or a specific, like the decision maker recommender, for example, was something we actually built, that they built, rather than using like an off-the-shelf OpenAI integration. And so first you need to think about like what skills do you have and what's the right structure that allows for that. If you don't have those skills and you're going to be working off of third-party tools, and that's going to influence where you can deploy. Again, in that instance, I would probably think about using it internally first, especially if there's a lot of resistance. Like, how do you improve your internal bandwidth by using these tools? Try them out, suss them out, understand their weak points, and then start to think about how you might introduce those to customers. If it makes sense at all. It may not make sense. You may need to hire internal resourcing to do more custom builds if you want to have AI integrated into your product.
Great. I know we're right at time. Let's wrap up with one last question,
Sure.
which is about your exciting future. Is there anything that you can share about Insight Med?
Sure. Insightful Med is a health literacy app. We feel like ideally built for patients and for providers to have a more conversational and informed conversation about your health. It reads your medical records. It pulls back relevant medical literature and papers that would be relevant to your care. There's a huge gap. People in tech are terrified to hear this, so I don't want to scare you all. But from research to clinical adoption, the average timeline is 17 years. And I believe that's like when the first iPhone was created. So like your doctor is working off of knowledge, like they're not necessarily paying attention or aware standards of care that have adopted in the last 2 decades, which is a travesty because there's 2 new research papers and breakthroughs in medicine like every minute. And so our goal is like, how do you bring that information to the point of care so that people can have more informed conversations and they're not working off of TikTok or Google or WebMD with information that's very generic or potentially wrong. And doctors hate. No one wants to, you go to your doctor and you say, I looked it up on Google, they like roll their eyes and walk out the door, right? So like that's not a very good patient experience and not one that's going to help you advocate for your health. So we are working on that problem. We have a manual prototype, but we're building towards a private beta, and I will be sure to share it out. Our growth loop is very patient-centric and led and has the share mechanism with providers. So I'm sure there'll be a case on it on Reforge and some artifacts at some point when I have more to share.
Well,
Thanks for
Erika,
asking.
thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing, and good luck with shortening that gap between 17 years of research to point of care. That's exciting. Well,
I know.
thank you.
Crazy.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge on growth and how you integrated AI. Folks, we'll be sharing the recording and slides via email afterwards. Otherwise, we'll let you all go. Thank you all very much.
Awesome. Have a great rest of your day. Bye, Paolo.